What if I told you America's sinking right now, not tomorrow, not decades from now, not after some major disaster. It's happening quietly, steadily, and mostly unnoticed. No earthquakes shaking the headlines, no explosions lighting up the sky, no emergency alerts buzzing on your phone. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous. Beneath America's cities, highways, farmland and neighborhoods, the ground itself is slowly giving way, not cracking open in dramatic fashion, but compressing, collapsing and sinking inch by inch. Scientists are calling this one of the most underestimated geological threats in US history, not because it's sudden, but because it's permanent. Once the land sinks, it does not rise again. This isn't a distant future scenario. It's not a prediction, and it's definitely not a theory. This is already happening, right now, across California, Texas, Arizona, Louisiana, Florida, and large parts of the Midwest. These aren't empty landscapes. These are places where millions of Americans live, drive, farm, and build their futures. The most unsettling part? Most people standing on this sinking ground will never feel a thing. There's no warning sign when it starts, no sound, no sudden movement, just subtle cracks in roads, unexpected flooding where none existed before, infrastructure quietly failing years earlier than it should. And by the time the danger becomes visible, the damage is already irreversible. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain. We're revealing what scientists are actually seeing beneath the surface, why America's ground is sinking silently, and why a growing number of experts believe parts of the country may have already crossed a point of no return. This isn't meant to scare you, it's meant to wake you up, because the most dangerous threats aren't always loud. Sometimes, they happen in silence. When people hear the phrase, "the ground is sinking," their mind jumps straight to disaster movie visuals, massive cracks ripping through streets, buildings collapsing overnight, entire cities falling apart in seconds. But that's not how this threat works. In reality, it's far more subtle and far more dangerous. The scientific term is land subsidence, a slow, gradual lowering of the Earth's surface. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't shake the ground, and most of the time, it doesn't even look like anything is happening at all. In many parts of the United States, the land sinks just millimeters or a few inches per year. That sounds harmless, almost invisible, easy to ignore, until you understand what that actually means over time. A few inches per year becomes feet over decades, and feet of sinking land permanently reshapes entire regions. This isn't erosion that can be repaired. This isn't soil that can simply be replaced. When land subsides, the underground structure collapses. The tiny spaces between soil and rock compress. Once those spaces are crushed, they're gone forever. That's why scientists keep repeating one chilling fact. Subsidence is irreversible. And here's why it's so hard to notice while it's happening. Roads don't suddenly cave in. They slowly warp. Highways develop uneven surfaces that require constant repairs. Rail tracks bend just enough to become unsafe. Pipelines don't explode, they quietly crack and leak. Water lines weaken. Gas lines strain under pressure they were never designed to handle. Buildings don't fall, they tilt. Walls develop hairline fractures. Foundations shift just enough to cause long-term structural damage. All of it happens slowly, quietly, invisibly. In some parts of the United States, particularly in heavily farmed or drought-prone regions, the land has already sunk more than 10 feet over the last century. That's the height of a one-story building, lost forever beneath the surface. And the most unsettling part? People lived on that land the entire time. They drove on those roads. They raised families in those homes. They never felt the ground move beneath their feet. Because subsidence doesn't feel like motion, it feels like nothing. Until flooding starts where it never did before, until infrastructure fails decades earlier than expected, until repair costs skyrocket and insurance disappears, and by then, it's too late. Scientists stress one crucial detail that separates land subsidence from most natural threats. Once the ground compresses, it cannot be uncompressed. No technology can lift it back up, no policy can reverse it, no amount of money can undo it. The land doesn't bounce back, it simply stays lower, permanently. And that's why sinking ground isn't just a geological issue. It's a silent, long-term transformation of the country itself. This is where the story stops being abstract and becomes deeply unsettling. Because America's sinking ground isn't caused by some mysterious force beneath the earth. It's largely caused by us. The primary driver behind widespread land subsidence in the United States is excessive groundwater pumping, a practice that has been quietly accelerating for decades. Beneath much of the country lie vast underground aquifers. These are natural water reservoirs stored between layers of soil, sand, clay, and rock. Some of them took thousands, even tens of thousands, of years to fill naturally. But in the last century, we've been draining them at historic speed. Cities rely on groundwater for drinking water. Farms rely on it to irrigate massive fields. During droughts, pumping increases even more. The problem isn't just that water is being removed, it's how fast it's being removed. When groundwater is pumped out too quickly, the underground system begins to fail. Here's what happens beneath the surface. The water that once supported layers of sediment disappears. Those layers begin to collapse under their own weight. Tiny air pockets and spaces compress. The ground above slowly sinks. Scientists often explain it with a simple analogy. Imagine a sponge filled with water. As long as the water is inside, the sponge keeps its shape. But squeeze the water out completely, and the sponge collapses. Now imagine trying to make it return to its original shape. You can't. That's exactly what's happening underground. Once those sediment layers compress, they lose their ability to hold water again. The aquifer doesn't just shrink, it becomes permanently damaged. The regions most affected are no coincidence. California's Central Valley, one of the most productive agricultural areas on Earth, has experienced some of the fastest subsidence rates ever recorded. Vast farmlands rely heavily on groundwater during dry years, and the land has paid the price. In Texas, agricultural regions have sunk steadily as irrigation demands increased. In Arizona's desert cities, rapid population growth has placed enormous pressure on underground water supplies. And in Louisiana's coastal zones, groundwater pumping combines with soft soils and rising sea levels, accelerating land loss at an alarming rate. But here's the most disturbing discovery scientists are now reporting. Even when groundwater pumping is reduced, the land often keeps sinking anyway. Why? Because the damage underground has already been done. Once the sediment structure collapses, it doesn't rebuild itself. The system doesn't reset. The land continues to compact under its own weight, sometimes for years or even decades after pumping slows. This means some regions are sinking today not because of current water use, but because of decisions made long ago. Scientists warn this creates a dangerous illusion of control. Reducing pumping is critical. Managing water sustainably is essential. But in many areas, it may no longer be enough to stop the sinking entirely. The ground remembers what was taken from it. And in some parts of America, that memory is written permanently into the land itself. Earthquakes strike in seconds. Floods arrive with visible waterlines. Hurricanes give days of warnings, satellite images, evacuation orders. Land subsidence does none of that. It doesn't roar. It doesn't shake. It doesn't announce itself on the news. It happens quietly, relentlessly, and often without a single moment that feels like a disaster. That's what makes it more dangerous than most natural threats. You can rebuild after an earthquake. You can drain water after a flood. You can reinforce structures after a storm. But you cannot rebuild sinking land. Subsidence is not a single event. It's a process, and that process never stops once it gains momentum. The consequences don't arrive all at once. They stack up slowly, year after year, problem after problem. Roads don't collapse. They buckle. Highways warp just enough to become unsafe, forcing constant repairs that never seem to hold. States spend millions fixing the same stretches of road over and over again, without addressing the real cause beneath them. Bridges weaken as uneven pressure pulls them in different directions. Structures designed to last a century begin aging decades faster than planned. Flood risk increases, not because storms are worse, but because the land is lower. Areas that never flooded before suddenly find themselves underwater after routine rainfall. Drainage systems fail because gravity no longer works the way engineers designed it to. In coastal regions, the danger multiplies. As land sinks, the ocean doesn't need to rise much to overwhelm it. Subsidence accelerates coastal erosion, allowing salt water to push farther inland, destroying wetlands, farmland, and natural flood barriers. This isn't theoretical. In California, sinking land has already damaged canals that deliver water to millions of people. Railways have warped. Highways have required endless reconstruction. The price tag is already in the billions of dollars. And rising. In Louisiana, the situation is even more alarming. There, subsidence combined with sea level rise is causing land to disappear entirely. Not erode, not flood temporarily. Disappear. Entire stretches of coastline that once existed on maps no longer exist on the ground. Communities aren't just at risk, they're slowly being erased. And here's where the crisis becomes personal. Entire neighborhoods across the country are becoming uninsurable. Not because of hurricanes, not because of floods, but because insurers understand something many homeowners don't yet realize. If the ground beneath a home is unstable, the risk never goes away. A storm can pass. Subsidence does not. Banks grow cautious. Property values stagnate or fall. Homeowners find themselves trapped in places they can't sell and can't afford to repair. And all of this happens without a clear disaster date. No single day marks the beginning. No dramatic footage signals the end. That's why scientists are sounding the alarm now. They warn this is not a short-term crisis. It's not something that can be patched with emergency funding or temporary fixes. This is a slow-moving national infrastructure emergency, one that weakens roads, water systems, transportation networks, and entire communities year after year, while remaining mostly invisible to the public. Earthquakes shock us, floods scare us, hurricanes force us to react. But land subsidence does something far more dangerous. It quietly changes the ground we depend on, until one day we realize the foundation was gone long before we noticed, and by then, there's no way to put it back. There's one sentence that keeps appearing again and again in scientific reports, government studies, and expert briefings. It's short, it's careful, and it's deeply unsettling. The damage may be permanent. This isn't dramatic language, this isn't fear-based wording meant to grab attention. This is how scientists speak when the evidence is undeniable. But the implications are hard to accept. When experts say permanent damage, they're not talking about temporary disruption or short-term inconvenience. They're talking about changes that cannot be reversed. Lost groundwater storage cannot be restored. Once underground sediment collapses, the space that once held water is gone forever. Even if rain returns, even if pumping stops, the natural storage system is broken. Sunk land will not rise again. There is no known technology capable of lifting entire regions back to their original elevation. No engineering project can undo decades of subsidence spread across thousands of square miles. Infrastructure costs will only increase. As land continues to sink unevenly, roads, bridges, pipelines, railways, and drainage systems will fail faster and more often. Repairs won't be one-time fixes, they'll become permanent maintenance burdens. And in some cases, scientists warn, entire areas may become unusable, not unsafe for a season, not temporarily restricted, but fundamentally incompatible with long-term human development. This is what makes the warning so disturbing. America isn't just facing damage, it's facing irreversible transformation. Parts of the country are physically changing shape, slowly, quietly, and permanently. And because this process doesn't look like a traditional disaster, it's easy to underestimate. There are no dramatic rescue operations, no breaking news countdowns, no single event that forces immediate action, just data, measurements, graphs that slope downward year after year. Experts worry this creates a dangerous delay in response. By the time the public fully understands what's happening, many decisions will already be locked in, not by policy, but by physics. And that's why scientists often frame this issue with a question about the future. They imagine a moment decades from now when future generations look back and ask, why didn't anyone act sooner when the warning signs were already clear? Why were short-term needs prioritized over long-term consequences? Why was the silence mistaken for safety? Because this threat didn't arrive with destruction. It arrived with absence. No shaking ground, no rushing water, no sudden collapse. Just a slow lowering of the land beneath homes, cities, and farmland, year after year, until the consequences became unavoidable. And once that line is crossed, there's no reset button. Scientists emphasize that action still matters. Water management, smarter planning, and early intervention can slow the damage and protect what remains. But they also warn against false comfort. Some losses are already locked in, some land is already gone. Some changes will define the landscape for generations. That's why this warning matters so much. Not because it predicts sudden collapse, but because it reveals a future shaped by what we ignore today. The ground didn't betray us. It responded exactly as physics said it would. And now, America faces a quiet truth. The most permanent damage isn't always caused by disaster. Sometimes it's caused by delay. Because this threat didn't explode. It didn't crash. It didn't announce itself. It whispered. The most dangerous changes on Earth aren't always violent. They don't arrive with explosions, sirens, or breaking news alerts. They don't force immediate action. And they don't look like disasters while they're happening. Sometimes they're silent, sometimes they're slow, and sometimes they happen right beneath our feet. America's ground is sinking, not everywhere, not all at once, but enough that scientists across the country are deeply concerned. Concerned not because of what might happen tomorrow, but because of what is already happening right now. This isn't a warning about some distant future. It's a reality unfolding quietly, year after year, inch by inch. And the truth is uncomfortable. Once the land sinks, it doesn't recover. Once underground systems collapse, they don't rebuild themselves. Once the foundation changes, everything built on top of it becomes more fragile. Roads, homes, farms, cities, all of it depends on ground we rarely think about, until it starts failing. What makes this threat so dangerous is how easy it is to ignore. Life goes on, people commute, crops grow, buildings stand. The absence of chaos creates the illusion of safety. But silence doesn't mean stability. Scientists aren't sounding this alarm to create fear. They're doing it because they understand something most people never have to think about. The earth keeps a record of every decision we make. Every gallon pumped, every aquifer drained, every warning delayed. That record is written into the land itself. And while some damage can still be slowed, managed, or prevented, other changes are already locked in. Some places will never return to what they once were. Future generations may inherit cities that require constant repair, coastlines that no longer exist, and landscapes reshaped not by sudden disaster, but by quiet neglect. And they may ask a simple question: how did something this serious stay invisible for so long? The answer may be uncomfortable because it didn't explode. It didn't flood overnight. It didn't shake the ground beneath us. It whispered. If this video made you pause, if it made you think differently about the ground you stand on, share it, because awareness is where responsibility begins, and silence, left unchecked, has a way of becoming permanent.